The village of Nethercombe was the sort of place that seemed to have emerged unscathed from the passing of time. Its cobbled streets, lined with honeyed stone cottages and neatly trimmed hedgerows, were rarely disturbed by anything more exciting than a stray cat or the occasional misplaced bicycle. Yet on this particular morning, the villagers were gathered in the churchyard with an unusual energy, for it was May Day, and the traditional maypole had been erected, its ribbons fluttering in a cheerful spring breeze. Children ran about, plaiting flowers into their hair, and the faint smell of freshly baked scones wafted from Mrs. Penhaligon's stall at the edge of the green. Miss Marple, leaning lightly on her walking stick, watched from the fringe of the crowd. She had returned to Nethercombe only the previous week, ostensibly to visit old friends and enjoy the quiet rhythms of village life, but her sharp eyes were never idle. The laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors, and the gentle clink of teacups all contained within them small insights into character. And Miss Marple knew well that character, left unchecked, could sometimes lead to dark places. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Strangeways, the vicar's wife, her eyes bright with the excitement of the festival. "You simply must join in the maypole dance today. It's all quite traditional, you know." "Oh, I dare say I should only get in the way," Miss Marple replied with a small, knowing smile. "But I shall watch and observe. Observing is half the pleasure." Nearby, young Timothy Hawkins was attempting, rather clumsily, to tie his ribbon to the top of the pole. He kept glancing nervously at his older sister, Eleanor, who shook her head in mock exasperation. Their mother, Lady Hawkins, stood at the edge of the green, overseeing the proceedings with an air of faintly imperious detachment. Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in the Hawkins family, the polite smiles, the careful avoidance of certain glances. Families, she had long learned, often kept secrets behind their most polished facades. As the music began, a sprightly tune played on an accordion by Mr. Gilbert, the village musician, the children formed a circle around the maypole, ribbons in hand. Laughter and cheers followed the twists and turns of the dance, and the scene was, in every outward sense, idyllic. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn elsewhere. She observed Mrs. Penhaligon bustling about her stall, exchanging soft words with Mr. Fletcher, the local grocer, whose face betrayed a flush that seemed slightly out of place in the morning sun. And then there was Dr. Collings, the village physician, standing apart with a rare frown etched across his usually calm features, his hand subconsciously tapping a watch that Miss Marple knew had not told the correct time for weeks. "Ah, but one can never be too careful," Miss Marple murmured to herself, just audible enough to be polite. "A festival brings out many things in people. Some are hidden even from themselves." It was at that very moment that a scream shattered the gentle harmony of the village square. The music halted abruptly, and all eyes turned toward the source, a small, narrow lane that led away from the green. There, sprawled across the cobbles, lay the figure of Mr. Henry Tilling, the village solicitor. His face was pale, his eyes wide in a frozen expression of terror, and a crimson stain spread across his waistcoat. A hush fell upon the crowd, the laughter and music replaced by shocked whispers. Mrs. Strangeways clutched her shawl and let out a stifled cry. "Oh dear, oh dear! Someone do something!" Miss Marple's gaze swept over the scene with unflinching calm. She noted the positions of the people closest to the body, their expressions, their hand movements, and even the slight odor of spilled ink from Mr. Tilling's coat pocket. Everyone was frozen, yet everyone was also speaking, speculating aloud, some offering ridiculous conjectures. But Miss Marple was not speaking. She was observing. In the midst of panic, it became clear that the solicitor was dead. The villagers murmured about accidents, fainting, or sudden illness, but Miss Marple quietly assessed the scene. This was no ordinary misfortune. Something had disturbed the natural order of Nethercombe, and the ripples would extend far beyond the maypole and its cheerful ribbons. Miss Marple took a small, deliberate step forward, her hand brushing against her walking stick. The crowd parted just enough for her to approach the body, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Already in that first moment, she sensed threads of deceit and fear that others could not yet name. The village, so serene and familiar, had suddenly become a puzzle, and someone among them had brought death into its heart, and Miss Marple, as always, would unravel it. The villagers of Nethercombe clustered nervously around the maypole, their earlier cheerfulness now replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. Mrs. Strangeways fluttered from one group to another, attempting to calm their fears with reassurances that seemed thin and fragile. Perhaps it was a sudden fainting spell. Nothing more, she suggested, though even she did not entirely believe her own words. Mr. Fletcher, the grocer, muttered darkly about the infirmities that could strike a man at any moment, while Mrs. Penhaligon's hands shook as she offered tea and biscuits in a futile attempt to restore order. Amid the murmurs, Miss Marple remained calm, her presence almost unremarkable, yet every so often she glanced from one villager to another with an expression that was both gentle and penetrating. Her mind was quietly noting inconsistencies, the subtleties of posture and expression that betrayed more than spoken words. The way Lady Hawkins' hand trembled as she adjusted her gloves, the way young Timothy tried desperately to avoid his sister's gaze, even the slightly too bright smile of Dr. Collins, all of it added threads to a tapestry she was already beginning to see clearly. "Everyone, please remain calm," called Constable Harris, who had arrived breathless from the station. He was a young man with earnest intentions, but his nervousness betrayed his inexperience. "The doctor will confirm what happened, and until then, we mustn't jump to conclusions." His eyes darted toward Dr. Collins, who was now kneeling beside Mr. Tilling's body, checking for signs of life that, alas, were already absent. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, noted the constable's hesitancy. Young men like him were often quick to assume guilt in the most obvious places and slow to notice the more subtle indications that only time and attention could reveal. She also noted that the villagers' eyes had begun to wander, searching for explanations. Gossip, she knew, was as natural as breathing in a place like Nethercombe, and already fragments of speculation were circulating. A business dispute, an old grudge, even a robbery gone wrong. Yet none of these whispered theories satisfied the quiet, precise logic of her observations. Lady Hawkins, who had so far maintained an air of detached concern, now approached the constable with a statement that seemed rehearsed. "Henry had been receiving letters," she said in a voice that was meant to convey composure but betrayed a subtle tremor. "Disturbing letters, apparently. But I never imagined—" Her voice faltered and she clutched her shawl. Miss Marple made a mental note of this. Premeditation in a letter could be a motive, but the telltale nervousness was what caught her attention far more sharply than the content itself. Nearby, Eleanor Hawkins whispered urgently to her mother, her eyes wide with fear. Timothy's ribbon had drooped from the maypole, forgotten in the confusion. Miss Marple watched him closely. He fidgeted, tugging at his collar, avoiding not only the eyes of the adults, but also those of his sister. Young children rarely hid malice, but they could conceal fear and guilt with startling skill. Miss Marple catalogued these observations carefully, storing them for later reflection. Mrs. Penhaligon's stall, once a source of village cheer, now seemed strangely ominous. Teacups rattled, and a half-empty plate of scones sat abandoned. She muttered something about not knowing what one should do, yet Miss Marple noticed the way her eyes lingered on Dr. Collins, the doctor who knelt by the corpse with clinical detachment. Perhaps it was nothing, yet Miss Marple was certain that even small gestures carried meaning. As the constable attempted to usher everyone back to their homes, rumors spread like wildfire. Some villagers spoke of Mr. Tilling's rumored involvement in a legal dispute over a neighboring estate. Others whispered of a clandestine visit he had made to London only days before. Miss Marple, however, did not chase rumors. She observed them. The way gossip traveled, who repeated it, who withheld it, all of it revealed far more about the speakers than the supposed victim. By the time Dr. Collins finally stood, brushing his hands on his coat, the villagers had assumed a more structured but tense formation. "It is as it appears," he said quietly. "Mr. Tilling has passed away. There is no immediate evidence of foul play, but I shall insist that the authorities investigate thoroughly." Miss Marple's eyes, however, had already picked up on subtleties. The angle of the body, the small smear of ink that had escaped the solicitor's pocket, and the barely perceptible bruise near his temple. Something, she decided, was amiss. The crowd began to disperse slowly, each person burdened with their own private fears and suspicions, and Miss Marple, adjusting her hat and taking a few careful steps forward, realized that the village of Nethercombe, so tranquil, so familiar, would never seem quite the same again. Beneath its idyllic exterior, there were tensions, secrets, and resentments that would not remain buried. And she, as always, would see them. The following morning brought a pale sun and a crisp breeze, but little comfort to Nethercombe. News of Mr. Tilling's death had traveled swiftly, and the village now hummed with muted anxiety rather than cheer. Miss Marple, carrying her basket as if for a casual errand, moved through the familiar streets with a quiet attentiveness. Faces turned in her direction, some with curiosity, some with apprehension, but she greeted each with her customary warmth, concealing the scrutiny beneath a kindly expression. At the vicarage, she found Mrs. Strangeways arranging flowers in the hall, though her hands trembled slightly. "I can't believe such a thing could happen here," she whispered. "Henry Tilling, so meticulous, so cautious. Who could do this?" Miss Marple merely nodded. "People are not always as cautious as they seem," she said softly, setting down her basket and allowing her gaze to wander. Even in these small gestures, the experienced observer could see a great deal. How Mrs. Strangeways' eyes flickered toward the window as though expecting something. How her lips pressed tightly when she mentioned Henry's prudence. Outside, villagers gathered in small clusters, exchanging fragments of information with hushed urgency. The grocer, Mr. Fletcher, stood near his shop, muttering about customers who had seemed nervous in the last few days. Mrs. Penhaligon's stall had been shuttered for the morning, and yet the aroma of her pastries lingered, a faint reminder of yesterday's festivity. Miss Marple noted that certain individuals avoided eye contact, while others lingered too long near places associated with Mr. Tilling, as if hoping to glean a clue through sheer proximity. Observation, she reminded herself, was more revealing than questioning. By mid-morning, Constable Harris had begun taking statements. Villagers were anxious to assert their knowledge, yet Miss Marple noticed how often their accounts conflicted. The timing of Mr. Tilling's arrival at the Green, the moment of the scream, and even the position of the maypole ribbons. Each detail shifted depending on who was speaking. The constable's frustration grew with every contradictory statement, and Miss Marple, quietly listening at the edge of the room, made her own mental notes of who seemed truthful and who merely wished to be perceived as such. Dr. Collins had returned briefly to his practice, leaving the official determination of cause in the hands of the coroner, but he appeared distracted, offering fleeting glances toward the Hawkins household. Miss Marple observed the doctor's manner carefully. His concern seemed sincere, yet the way he adjusted his watch repeatedly suggested a preoccupation with time, perhaps a signal of a meeting, or an attempt to conceal something. Timing, in her experience, was as important as any physical clue. Later, Miss Marple visited the Hawkins residence under the guise of offering sympathy. Lady Hawkins received her politely, though the effort to mask her unease was evident. Eleanor hovered nearby, her expression anxious, while Timothy fidgeted with a small ribbon he had salvaged from the maypole. "We were all so shocked," Lady Hawkins said, her voice steady but lacking conviction. "Henry was... He was always so precise. It is impossible to understand such a sudden tragedy. Miss Marple merely nodded, allowing the silence to stretch between them. In silence, people revealed more than in words. Eleanor eventually spoke, her voice low and hurried. He argued with Father yesterday about the estate papers, but Henry, he would never harm anyone. He was careful. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her face. Careful, yes, but human. And humans could err, or deceive. It was the smallest details, the hesitation, the avoidance of direct gaze, that spoke most loudly. By the late afternoon, the village seemed to settle into an uneasy routine. Shops reopened, children played cautiously in the lanes, and the church bells rang as though to restore normality. Yet beneath it all, a subtle current of suspicion flowed, and Miss Marple sensed that several villagers were already measuring one another against hidden motives. Some feared accusations. Others feared that the truth might expose them in ways they could not yet imagine. Miss Marple herself returned to her modest lodging at the edge of the village, her mind occupied not by grief, but by observation. She reviewed what she had seen, the trembling hands, the furtive glances, the oddly timed movements, and began to piece together patterns invisible to all but the most attentive observer. The threads were faint, delicate, but they existed. And when woven together, they might reveal the presence of someone who had disrupted the gentle rhythm of Nethercombe with a single, fatal act. As evening fell and the village lights blinked on like watchful eyes, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window. Outside, the streets were quiet, but she knew well that the calm was deceptive. Secrets, resentments, and unspoken grievances lingered in the air, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And she, quietly, would see them before anyone else. The following morning, the village of Nethercombe seemed to awaken under a heavier sky. Rumors had hardened into conviction, and already the villagers whispered of who might be responsible for Henry Tilling's death. Constable Harris, encouraged by the appearance of an apparent clue, a small folded note found in the solicitor's coat pocket, was quick to form a theory. He gathered a group of villagers near the green, gesturing toward Lady Hawkins with a hopeful insistence. "It seems we may have some direction at last," he said, voice tinged with triumph. Lady Hawkins, still composed, inclined her head politely but gave no reply. Eleanor and Timothy stood beside her, the older sister's face pale yet firm, while the younger boy fidgeted with a handkerchief he had carried absent-mindedly. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, noted the constable's eagerness with mild amusement. So many sought an immediate resolution, yet the truth rarely revealed itself so easily. It was human nature, she thought, to seize the most obvious target and hope it was the correct one. The note itself, yellowed and neatly folded, contained only a terse line. "Meet me at the green at noon. Important. H.T." Constable Harris believed it implicated someone who had known the solicitor personally, someone who might have quarreled with him over business or family matters. He began questioning the villagers in earnest, his questions direct and hurried. Most offered vague statements about having seen Mr. Tilling conversing with acquaintances the previous day, while a few admitted they had not seen him at all. Miss Marple, listening silently, observed not just what was said, but how it was said. Mrs. Penhaligon, when asked, smoothed her apron nervously and kept glancing toward the churchyard where the maypole had stood. Her words were measured, almost rehearsed, yet the eyes betrayed unease. Mr. Fletcher's voice trembled slightly as he mentioned seeing Mr. Tilling leave the grocer's shop, and Dr. Colling's calm description of his movements carried an almost imperceptible note of reluctance. Every detail was, as always, significant. The Hawkins family, already under subtle scrutiny, found themselves the focus of repeated questioning. Lady Hawkins maintained a dignified silence, allowing her children to respond in her stead. Eleanor's account was careful, Yet she hesitated when describing her brother's actions near the maypole, while Timothy's voice faltered entirely when pressed about the letters Henry had received. Miss Marple observed all of this with gentle patience, noting the inconsistencies that might otherwise escape notice. Fear, embarrassment, and loyalty all played across their faces in patterns that only experience could decode. By midday, the constable had identified an individual he considered the most likely suspect. Mr. James Cartwright, a local landowner who had recently clashed with Mr. Tilling over boundary disputes, was summoned to the vicarage for questioning. Cartwright arrived, his gait stiff and controlled, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the onlookers gathered outside. Miss Marple watched his hands, clasped tightly in front, fingers tapping imperceptibly, and the way he avoided prolonged eye contact. Not guilt, necessarily, she reflected, but certainly awareness of the suspicion directed toward him. The villagers gathered around, their murmurs sharpening into pointed speculation. Cartwright's reputation for brusqueness, combined with the recent arguments over land, made him a convenient focus for their anxiety. Constable Harris, buoyed by their attention, began to outline the circumstances as though they confirmed his theory. Yet Miss Marple noted the careful composure of Cartwright's responses. Every word seemed deliberate, measured, and rehearsed, but not deceptive. There was caution in abundance, but not the impulsive panic of someone who had acted violently. Meanwhile, smaller details continued to surface in Miss Marple's mind. The ink smudge on Mr. Tilling's waistcoat, the subtle crease in the note, the direction of footprints near the maypole, none of it pointed definitively to Cartwright. Observing human behavior, she knew, was far more revealing than any outwardly convincing quarrel or motive conveniently cited. Still, she allowed the constable to proceed with his questioning, remaining in the background, gently cataloguing every glance, hesitation, and tremor. By late afternoon, the villagers began to disperse, though whispers persisted like a low murmur throughout the streets. Cartwright was escorted home, protesting his innocence in the softest tones, and the constable felt certain he was closing in on the solution. Yet Miss Marple, reflecting quietly in her sitting room later that day, realized that the outwardly obvious suspect was rarely the true perpetrator. People, when pressed by circumstance, often revealed themselves not through words, but through the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in demeanor. And she intended to watch those shifts with patience and care. As dusk settled over Nethercombe, a quiet unease lingered in the air. The village might have assumed a direction in its inquiry, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, the story was far from complete. Secrets yet unspoken, fears yet unexamined, and motives carefully concealed awaited her scrutiny. And she, as always, would observe until the truth could be seen in full. That afternoon, Miss Marple strolled through the village with a deliberate unhurriedness, exchanging polite greetings while keeping her eyes and ears sharply attuned. The streets of Nethercombe were quieter than usual. Shutters half closed, shop doors slightly ajar, as if the village itself hesitated to confront the unsettling truth of the morning. Every so often, she would pause, adjusting her hat or inspecting a flower, giving the appearance of idle curiosity, while in reality she catalogued the minutiae of movement, expression, and gesture around her. It was near Mrs. Penhaligon's stall, long since shuttered for the day, that she noticed the detail that had escaped the constable and the villagers alike. A small smudge of ink on the cobblestones, faint but deliberate, traced a line from the direction of the maypole toward the narrow lane where Mr. Tilling had fallen. It was subtle, so subtle that one could almost dismiss it as an accident. Yet the placement suggested a deliberate movement of papers or correspondence, with a kind of minor oversight that often betrayed far larger intentions. Miss Marple crouched slightly, her gaze following the barely perceptible trail, noting its trajectory and the pressure points in the uneven stones. Nearby, the Hawkins children passed by, Timothy still clutching the ribbon he had salvaged. Eleanor's eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, as though searching for some understanding she could not articulate. Miss Marple inclined her head ever so slightly, signaling nothing, yet inviting trust. In those brief exchanges, she perceived the subtle anxiety that lingered in their expressions, the nervous hesitation, the faint tightening around the mouth, the slight shift in posture when they thought themselves unobserved. These details, she knew, could not be manufactured. They were the unconscious signals of conscience, fear, or secret knowledge. Miss Marple continued her walk, moving toward the churchyard where the maypole still stood as a silent witness. Here, she paused again, noting the uneven footprints of those who had gathered around the solicitor. There was a disturbance in the soil at the base of the pole, subtle enough that only someone paying close attention would notice. The indentation suggested a struggle, or perhaps an attempt to conceal something hastily. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the anomaly, linking it with the ink smudge and the faint crease in the note the constable had discovered. These were the threads that, when combined, would form a pattern invisible to those who only sought obvious guilt. By late afternoon, she visited Dr. Collings under the pretense of inquiring after the villagers' general well-being. The doctor greeted her with professional courtesy, but his eyes betrayed distraction, and there was a slight hesitation in his movements as he handed her a cup of tea. "The villagers are all very shaken," he remarked, as though stating the obvious, yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtle tremor in his hand, the way he avoided direct gaze. Nothing he said contradicted the facts, but she sensed a careful navigation, an effort to guide interpretation without stating it outright. Returning to her lodgings, Miss Marple reflected on the small, seemingly insignificant details she had collected. The ink smudge, the creased note, the impression in the soil, the nuances of behavior. Each was minor alone, yet together they hinted at movement, hesitation, and concealment. While Constable Harris and the villagers were drawn to the most visible suspect, these subtleties pointed elsewhere. Miss Marple knew the importance of patience. An overlooked clue was often the keystone that would reveal the true architect of a crime. As evening fell, she wandered once more past the Hawkins residence. Through the lace curtains, she observed the family quietly moving about their rooms. Eleanor carefully rearranged books on a shelf. Timothy lingered near the window, and Lady Hawkins paused at the mirror, adjusting her hair with a faintly anxious hand. Each movement was ordinary, yet Miss Marple perceived the invisible web of concern and secrecy in which the family was now ensnared. Human nature, she mused, had a tendency to betray itself in the smallest of ways, and those minor betrayals were often far more revealing than words spoken aloud. Night descended upon Nethercombe, the quiet streets reflecting pools of lamplight that glimmered against the corbels. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window, the faint scent of tea lingering in the room. Her observations of the day, subtle though they were, had begun to form a pattern. Somewhere within these small deviations and overlooked traces lay the truth of Mr. Tilling's death, and Miss Marple, as always, would see it before anyone else, waiting patiently for the moment when all the hidden pieces could be recognized in full. By the following morning, Nethercombe carried an air of tense vigilance. Word of Mr. Tilling's death had spread beyond the immediate circle of witnesses, and every corner of the village seemed alive with quiet scrutiny. Miss Marple moved among them with the unobtrusive grace that had long served her well, listening more than she spoke, observing subtleties others scarcely noticed. Conversations were clipped, careful, as if every villager feared revealing too much, or worse, too little. Mrs. Strangeways, fidgeting with the folds of her apron, approached Miss Marple first. "I've been thinking about poor Henry," she whispered. "He had so many dealings in the village, and not all of them were friendly, you know. Secrets, quarrels, misunderstandings. One can never tell what is hidden beneath the polite surface." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the remark while her eyes scanned the small group lingering nearby. Indeed, politeness often masked resentment, and Nethercombe, in its calm appearance, was no exception. Later, she visited the grocer, Mr. Fletcher, ostensibly to purchase a few necessities. He spoke, rapidly, almost spilling words as he recounted a minor argument he had overheard between Mr. Tilling and a neighbouring farmer regarding property boundaries. It was heated, but surely nothing to cause this, he stammered, glancing nervously at the windows as though expecting someone to overhear. Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward the door. Fear or complicity, she did not yet decide, but the detail mattered. At the Hawkins residence, the atmosphere was equally taut. Lady Hawkins maintained her usual poise, yet Miss Marple observed the fine tremor of her fingers as she set down teacups. Eleanor, tense and watchful, spoke haltingly about Henry's sudden departure to the Green on the day of the festival, carefully avoiding the mention of any quarrel or letters. Timothy, meanwhile, fidgeted with the maypole ribbon, his gaze flitting between his mother and sister, betraying an anxiety that went beyond the morning's tragic events. Miss Marple catalogued each nuance, storing them as quietly as if arranging fragile pieces of porcelain. Later in the day, she made her way to the narrow lane where Mr. Tilling had been found. The shadows of late afternoon stretched long across the cobblestones, and she paused at the very spot where the faint smudge of ink had caught her attention the day before. Kneeling, she traced the mark lightly with her finger, noting how it led subtly toward a drain. An inconspicuous hiding place for papers or correspondence, easily overlooked by less meticulous eyes. Above all, she reflected on the reactions of those present. Mr. Fletcher's hesitation, Lady Hawkins' careful avoidance of discussion, and Dr. Collings's subtle distraction. Each reaction seemed, to her trained eye, a small piece of the greater puzzle. Word soon reached her of a dispute that had occurred years earlier, long before the festival, between Mr. Tilling and James Cartwright over the sale of a neighbouring parcel of land. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about insults exchanged and reputations wounded, and yet when Miss Marple reflected on the men involved, she noted how Cartwright's composure remained steady under scrutiny, while others, those with less obvious grievances, displayed the tiniest indications of anxiety. It was not the loud quarrels, she reminded herself, that often led to tragedy, but the quiet resentments hidden and nurtured over years. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to her lodgings, reflecting on the cumulative weight of observation. The village had its obvious suspects, the constable had his neat theories, but beneath the surface, a network of secrets and half-truths threaded its way through Nethercombe. Every villager she had encountered held small, silent motives, emotional undercurrents that were imperceptible to those who judged only by appearance or reputation. These currents, subtle and often contradictory, were what she would rely upon to discern the truth. Settling by her window as twilight softened the village's edges, Miss Marple sipped her tea, considering the day's revelations. Shadows stretched across the green, echoing the hidden complexities she had observed. Beneath polite conversation and quiet civility lay envy, old grievances, and unspoken rivalries. Somewhere within these subtleties, the real story of Mr. Tilling's death waited to be uncovered, and Miss Marple, patient and attentive, was already poised to see it clearly when the moment arrived. The morning air in Nethercombe carried a sharp clarity, yet beneath it lay the familiar tension that had settled over the village since Mr. Tilling's death. Villagers moved cautiously, their conversations muted and eyes darting as though expecting revelation or accusation at any moment. Miss Marple, her basket balanced lightly on her arm, wandered through the streets with a casual gait, absorbing the subtleties that others overlooked. By mid-morning, news reached the village that a second incident had occurred. A letter, apparently torn and crumpled, had been discovered in the Hawkins garden, partially hidden beneath a flower pot. The words it contained were cryptic, yet urgent. "If you know what is best, say nothing. H.T." Mrs. Strangeways carried it trembling in her hand, her face pale as she handed it over to the constable. The villagers, already primed with suspicion, whispered fiercely, and eyes turned once again toward Lady Hawkins and her children. Miss Marple noted the reactions carefully. Lady Hawkins remained composed, though a faint tremor of the hand holding her teacup betrayed her unease. Eleanor's lips pressed together as she avoided direct gaze, and Timothy clutched a corner of his ribbon, twisting it nervously. In their behavior, Miss Marple recognized the subtle tension that accompanies fear or guilt, though she withheld judgment. Often, the loudest reactions concealed the smallest truths, and vice versa. Meanwhile, Mr. Cartwright, the so-called prime suspect, appeared to be moving through his day with a cautious normality, yet his land agent had reported an unusual visit to Cartwright Hall the previous evening, with Mr. Cartwright seen pacing the drawing room, papers spread before him as though awaiting an expected visitor who never arrived. Miss Marple made a mental note of this. Appearances of calm could hide internal agitation, and careful timing often played a critical role in understanding human motives. As the day progressed, other villagers began to recount incidents they had dismissed initially. Mrs. Penhaligon mentioned seeing Mr. Tilling conversing briefly with Dr. Collings the day before his death, their discussion carried out in lowered tones. Mr. Fletcher admitted that he had observed Cartwright's carriage parked unusually late near the green, though he had not paid it much attention at the time. Each revelation, minor in isolation, began to weave a pattern of intersecting paths and untold interactions. Miss Marple returned to the site of the maypole, her eyes scanning the ground for details unnoticed by others. The faint ink smudge persisted, and the soil near the pole revealed additional disturbances. A small fragment of torn paper and the subtle impressions of hurried footsteps. She considered the timing, the location, and the behavior of those present, recognizing that the layers of movement and concealment suggested more than mere coincidence. Someone had taken great care to hide intentions. Yet, as always, the human element left imperceptible traces. By late afternoon, a gathering of villagers convened at the vicarage, spurred by the emerging pattern of clues and the new letter. Discussion grew heated, each person eager to assert a theory, yet Miss Marple observed quietly from the side. Accusations were cast, speculation ran rampant, and the constable, increasingly frustrated, attempted to maintain order. And through it all, Miss Marple noticed the small signs, the tremor of a hand, the fleeting glance, the hesitation before speech that spoke more clearly than any words of guilt or innocence. As dusk fell over Nethercombe, Miss Marple lingered on the steps of the vicarage, surveying the village below. Shadows stretched long across the cobbled streets, intermingling with the quiet murmur of suspicion that had settled over every doorstep. The new evidence had stirred the surface, shifting attention from one person to another, yet beneath the shifting patterns lay the truth, hidden but discernible to a patient and observant eye. Miss Marple, as ever, was watching, cataloguing, and preparing to discern it when the moment was right. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly reviewing her observations, her mind weaving together the delicate threads of behavior, timing, and hidden intention. Though Constable Harris and the villagers were consumed by the outward appearances of guilt and the more obvious quarrels, she knew that true insight lay in the subtle, almost imperceptible signals people left behind. By mid-morning, she determined it was time to put her suspicions to the test, engaging a key figure in a subtle game that would reveal the truth without arousing defensive postures. She called upon Lady Hawkins under the pretense of offering further sympathy and guidance on coping with the villagers' concern. The lady received her graciously, though her eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of unease, a detail Miss Marple noted immediately. Tea was served, and Miss Marple let the conversation drift lightly, touching on trivial village matters, the May Day festival, and the absent-mindedness of Mr. Tilling. She observed closely, letting her questions appear casual while they gently probed for reaction. Eleanor hovered nearby, listening in with polite attentiveness. Miss Marple mentioned, almost in passing, the torn letter found in the garden, allowing a pause for observation. "Curious, isn't it?" she said softly, stirring her tea. "One might wonder why Henry would write such a note and then allow it to be discovered." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her handkerchief, and a faint flush rose to her cheeks. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the hesitation, noting the tiny avoidance of direct eye contact, the subtle shift in posture that betrayed discomfort. Lady Hawkins spoke, her tone steady, about the letter as though dismissing it. "Henry always had peculiar habits," she said. "I imagine it was a precautionary measure, or perhaps he simply meant to mislead anyone who might stumble upon it." Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet the glance Eleanor exchanged with her mother spoke volumes, an unspoken acknowledgement of knowledge withheld. Timothy, now standing near the doorway, fidgeted with his maypole ribbon. Miss Marple let her gaze linger on him as she made a casual remark about the festival. "Children are so easily distracted by trivialities," she mused, "yet sometimes they notice things adults overlook." Timothy's head jerked slightly, a tiny sign of recognition, or perhaps guilt, and Miss Marple catalogued it carefully, storing each detail for the larger picture. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple guided her questions with subtlety, allowing hints to slip naturally into the discussion. She inquired about Mr. Tilling's recent visits, the arguments over property disputes, and his interactions with Mr. Cartwright. Lady Hawkins answered smoothly, yet the small discrepancies, the avoidance of certain names, the faltering mention of visits, revealed that someone was carefully managing the truth. Miss Marple's method was simple but effective. Present a scenario, watch for reactions, and note which details were instinctively protected. By mid-afternoon, she had observed enough. The careful monitoring of eye movement, tone, hesitation, and gesture revealed a network of anxiety and secret knowledge among the Hawkins family. The children's subtle signals, combined with the mother's practiced calm, pointed toward understanding that had been deliberately concealed. Miss Marple, in her quiet manner, had allowed them to reveal themselves without accusation, creating a psychological environment in which instinctive truths could surface naturally. As she rose to take her leave, she reflected on the effectiveness of patience and subtlety. The constable might have relied on evidence easily seen, and the villagers on rumor and conjecture, but human nature, observed closely, never lies. The patterns were clear. Fear, avoidance, and careful deflection marked those who knew more than they admitted, and Miss Marple's quiet strategy had brought those patterns to light. Returning to her window that evening, she watched Nethercombe settle under the soft glow of twilight. The village, still outwardly calm, hid layers of truth in its genteel facades. Miss Marple knew that the moment of revelation was approaching. All the pieces were present, awaiting the gentle guidance of logic and observation to align. And when the time came, the real story of Mr. Tilling's death would be revealed in full. By the following morning, the villagers of Nethercombe were gathered once more at the vicarage, their murmurs carrying the restless tension of days spent in uncertainty. Miss Marple arrived quietly, her presence calm and unobtrusive, yet her eyes were alert, taking in the smallest details of posture, expression, and gesture. She had spent the previous day observing, connecting subtle signs of fear, hesitation, and concealment, and now the time had come to draw together the threads of understanding that had been quietly accumulating. She began with a gentle address, speaking as if in casual conversation, yet every word was designed to provoke reflection. "It is curious," she said softly, "how often people overlook the smallest details, a smudge of ink, the fold of a note, a footprint pressed lightly into the soil. These are all unremarkable in themselves, yet they can reveal much when considered together. The villagers shifted uneasily, their attention drawn by the quiet authority in her tone. Miss Marple then recounted the events surrounding the maypole, carefully noting the timeline of Mr. Tilling's movements. She spoke of the smudge of ink near the pole, the torn letter found in the Hawkins garden, and the small disturbances in the soil. Each clue, she explained, pointed not toward the obvious quarrels or the heated arguments over land, but toward someone who had observed, concealed, and calculated. Someone familiar with the habits and weaknesses of the solicitor himself. Her gaze lingered briefly on the Hawkins family. Lady Hawkins's expression remained composed, yet the faint tension in her hands and the subtle shifting of her children's weight betrayed the unease she could not entirely suppress. "It is often the quietest among us who understand the greatest truths," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but deliberate. "And it is to them that one must pay careful attention." She described the subtle inconsistencies she had noticed. Eleanor's avoidance of certain names, Timothy's nervous handling of the maypole ribbon, and Lady Hawkins' careful modulation of her words. The villagers listened, piecing together a story that had eluded them for days. Miss Marple's gentle observations revealed that Mr. Tilling had not died from a mere accident or spontaneous fainting, but from a moment of carefully concealed intervention, an act executed in a place and at a time chosen for its apparent innocuousness. Turning slightly, Miss Marple explained the significance of the ink smudge. It indicated that papers had been handled deliberately, perhaps removed or replaced in a way that seemed unimportant to the casual observer. The torn letter, hidden beneath the flower pot, was not an attempt at intimidation but a signal meant to mislead any onlooker, creating the impression of forewarning without revealing intent. Each subtle act had been designed to misdirect attention, to conceal a precise action undertaken by someone who understood the village, the solicitor, and the natural inclinations of the people around him. Finally, she spoke of the psychological evidence, the carefully concealed glances, the almost imperceptible hesitation, and the shifts in posture that betrayed knowledge and guilt. It was Eleanor, guided by instinct and a protective desire toward her family, who had handled the notes and allowed them to be discovered in a way that deflected suspicion. Lady Hawkins, though composed and deliberate, had sought to shield her children, and Timothy, young and observant, had reacted with nervous anxiety. Small, revealing gestures that spoke far louder than words ever could. The villagers absorbed her reasoning in silence. Constable Harris, who had so confidently pursued Mr. Cartwright, now saw the flaw in his assumptions. The evidence that seemed obvious had merely been a distraction, a convenient target obscuring the true pattern of subtle human behavior. Miss Marple, with her characteristic patience and understanding of human nature, had revealed the truth not through forensic examination or loud accusation, but through the careful study of gestures, hesitation, and hidden knowledge. As the quiet settled over the room, she concluded with a gentle smile. The truth, though sometimes obscured, is seldom beyond recognition. It lies not only in what we do, but in what we cannot help revealing. The Hawkins family, now freed from undue suspicion, sighed in relief, while the constable quietly acknowledged the accuracy of her deductions. Nethercombe, for the first time since Mr. Tilling's death, felt the weight of clarity returning to its gentle streets, though the memory of the events would linger in quiet reflection. The days that followed in Nethercombe were marked by a cautious return to routine. Shops reopened, the children's laughter returned to the lanes, and the faint scent of Mrs. Penhaligon's pastries drifted once again through the air. Yet beneath this semblance of normality, the village carried the quiet weight of recent events, a subtle unease that lingered in doorways and corners. Miss Marple, strolling through the familiar streets with her basket, observed it all with her usual quiet attention. Life had resumed its outward calm, but the patterns of human nature she had witnessed remained imprinted on the village's memory. At the Hawkins residence, a sense of relief mingled with lingering tension. Lady Hawkins had regained her composed demeanor, yet Miss Marple noted the faint softness in her expression, the way her eyes occasionally reflected on the events of that fateful day. Eleanor busied herself with organizing letters and household accounts, while Timothy, a little more confident now, carefully restored the maypole ribbon to its rightful place, his fingers no longer trembling. Each movement, ordinary as it appeared, spoke of lessons learned and vigilance tempered by understanding. The constable resumed his duties with a quieter, more thoughtful approach. Mr. Cartwright, once wrongly suspected, visited the grocer and neighbors, extending apologies and offering explanations. Nethercombe, though outwardly cordial, absorbed the lessons of misplaced suspicion, the villagers' conversations now shaded by awareness of how easily appearances could mislead. Miss Marple, moving among them, smiled ever so slightly to herself. Human behavior, after all, was a subtle but consistent guide when observed with care and patience. Miss Marple spent a quiet afternoon in her lodging, reflecting upon the case. The overt motives, the quarrels, and the immediate reactions had been the distractions, while the real truth had revealed itself in the softest gestures, the avoidance of direct gaze, the minute hesitations, the careful concealment of knowledge. It was, she thought, a reminder that human nature was rarely as it appeared on the surface. The real story lay in what people could not help showing, no matter how politely they tried to mask it. Later, she wandered through the village green, observing familiar faces returning to their routines. Conversations resumed, punctuated by laughter and the occasional sigh, and the village slowly reclaimed the gentle rhythm that had existed before the tragedy. Yet Miss Marple noted that the villagers' eyes had changed subtly. They now carried an unspoken attentiveness, a quiet awareness that every interaction might reveal more than it seemed. People were learning, in their own way, the value of patience and careful observation. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her window seat, the soft glow of lamplight casting gentle shadows across the room. She allowed herself a small sigh, a gesture of contentment and reflection. The village had endured disruption, yet order had been restored. The hidden truths had been brought to light, not through force or confrontation, but through understanding, empathy, and quiet reasoning. Observing, reflecting, and waiting had yielded clarity, the kind of clarity that outlasted immediate suspicion and rumor. As night deepened, the streets of Nethercombe lay quiet under a canopy of stars, the cottages standing like sentinels of ordinary life now slightly altered by the events they had witnessed. Miss Marple, her thoughts calm and deliberate, considered the patterns she had discerned, the subtle ways in which fear, loyalty, and conscience intersected, guiding actions and reactions alike. Human nature, she mused, was endlessly intricate, and while people might be capable of error, they were also capable of insight, if one only watched closely enough. And so the village settled, not entirely untouched by the shadow of the past, yet carrying forward with renewed understanding. Miss Marple, as always, observed from her quiet vantage, content to leave the ordinary world to its routines while the hidden truths of Nethercombe remained remembered, preserved by her patient scrutiny. The gentle rhythm of life continued, shaped subtly by knowledge, reflection, and the quiet lessons learned from tragedy. Though the main events of the case had resolved and Nethercombe had settled into a semblance of routine, the village still carried a delicate undercurrent of reflection. Villagers went about their days with ordinary gestures, purchasing bread, tending gardens, or chatting along the lanes. But Miss Marple, ever attentive, noted the subtle ways the past week had shaped them. Eyes lingered a little longer on neighbors, voices had grown a touch more measured, and small gestures, once careless, were now deliberate, as though each person had internalized lessons learned without consciously acknowledging them. One afternoon she called on Mrs. Strangeways, who was still quietly musing over the events at the Maypole. The elderly woman's hands shook slightly as she poured tea, though her voice was calm, almost reflective. "It is strange, you know, Miss Marple," she said, "how a single act can ripple through the entire village. People who seemed so ordinary revealed depths one never suspected." Miss Marple inclined her head, acknowledging the truth in the observation. "Indeed," she replied, "but it is not that they change entirely. Rather, they become more visible to those who watch carefully. Character, after all, is always present. It simply takes circumstance to reveal it." Across the village, the Hawkins household had resumed its quiet routines, though the gentle shadow of recent events lingered. Lady Hawkins moved with her usual poise, yet the careful attention she gave to Eleanor and Timothy revealed a subtle wariness, a vigilance born of recent revelations. Eleanor, now more reflective, seemed to measure her words and actions with a newfound awareness, while Timothy, once prone to impulsive fidgeting, handled tasks with deliberate care. Miss Marple recognized in them the quiet resilience that often follows shock, not the bravado of quick recovery, but the deep, steady acceptance of lessons learned. Miss Marple herself spent the late afternoon wandering toward the green, where the maypole stood upright once more, adorned with its colorful ribbons. Children's laughter carried on the breeze, mingling with the gentle clatter of cart wheels and the hum of village activity. Yet even in this ordinary scene, she observed the subtle echoes of the past week, the faint glances cast toward the pole, the cautious steps taken near certain paths, the murmurs that seemed to pause when certain villagers passed. These echoes, she thought, were the village's way of remembering and reconciling, a soft acknowledgement of human frailty and the lessons drawn from error. She paused near the flower beds where the torn letter had been found. The soil was undisturbed, the petals gleaming with dew, yet Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the faintest impressions left in the earth, nearly invisible to any casual observer. Such minor traces, she reflected, were emblematic of human behavior itself. Subtle, often unnoticed, yet revealing far more than the loud or obvious actions. Observation, patience, and gentle reflection could illuminate truths even when they seemed buried beneath layers of routine. As evening approached, she returned to her lodgings, the village bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the cool hush of approaching night. The streets, now familiar in their quiet intimacy, held traces of every whispered suspicion, every subtle gesture, every hidden motive that had shaped the recent events. Miss Marple considered the constable's initial certainty, the villagers' eagerness for resolution, and the intricate interplay of fear, loyalty, and subtle concealment that had characterized the Hawkins family's behavior. All of it, she noted, had been visible to the careful observer if one only knew where and how to look. Settling into her chair by the window, she sipped her tea and allowed herself a moment of reflection. Nethercombe had resumed its outward calm, yet the quiet truths she had discerned would remain, embedded in memory and subtly influencing the interactions of its residents. Human nature, she mused, was endlessly complex, capable of error and concealment, yet equally capable of revealing itself in the smallest, most revealing details. With patience and attention, these truths could always be discerned. And so, with the night deepening and the village breathing in its gentle rhythm, Miss Marple rested her thoughts on the enduring lessons of observation, empathy, and the quiet unraveling of hidden motives. The case was concluded, but the understanding it brought lingered, shaping perception and nurturing the subtle clarity that came from careful, unwavering attention to human nature. The morning dawned crisp and bright over Nethercombe, as though the village itself had been holding its breath, waiting for resolution. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar lanes, sensed a subtle shift in the air, The tension that had clung to doors and windows for days had begun to lift, replaced by quiet reflection. Villagers exchanged cautious smiles, spoke in hushed tones, and moved with a gentler attentiveness. Yet, beneath this outward calm, the lessons of the past week had left indelible impressions, an awareness of how easily appearances could deceive and how closely human behavior must be observed to discern truth. Miss Marple made her way to the green once more, where the maypole stood tall and bright, its ribbons fluttering in the breeze. She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the familiar faces. Lady Hawkins, Eleanor, and Timothy were nearby, tending to small tasks with a composure born not merely of relief, but of understanding. Miss Marple knew that the subtle traces she had observed, the furtive glances, the small hesitations, the carefully managed gestures, were still present, quietly shaping behavior and revealing character. Gathering the villagers in the shade of the maypole, Miss Marple spoke gently, yet with the quiet authority that compelled attention. "It has been said that accidents can happen to anyone, but rarely does one see a pattern in mere chance," she began. "In Mr. Tilling's case, the evidence that first seemed obvious, the quarrels, the property disputes, the heated words, was only a surface, a distraction from what truly occurred. The real story, as so often, was written not in anger or loud gestures, but in subtleties." She recounted the clues with care, revisiting the faint ink smudge near the pole, the torn letter hidden beneath the flower pot, and the disturbed soil that seemed innocuous at first glance. These small details, overlooked by many, revealed the careful hand of someone who understood the habits, fears, and protective instincts of those around him, Miss Marple explained. Yet in observing reactions, in noticing hesitation and avoidance, one can see truths that even deception cannot fully hide. Her gaze turned to Eleanor, whose eyes met hers with the faintest flicker of recognition. It was not a loud quarrel that led to Mr. Tilling's death, nor was it a spontaneous act of malice. The letters, the careful concealment, and the deliberate timing were the work of someone acting with instinctive understanding, someone who sought to protect loved ones while maintaining the appearance of innocence. It was, in essence, a quiet intervention guided by conscience and subtlety. The villagers murmured softly, realizing that the person they had least suspected, the young Eleanor, under the careful guidance of her mother, had navigated a delicate balance of protection and concealment. Miss Marple's calm explanation revealed that every gesture, every hesitation, and every carefully measured act had been visible to a discerning observer. Lady Hawkins nodded faintly, confirming the protective intention behind the minor deceptions, while Timothy, now relieved, fidgeted no more with the maypole ribbon. "Human nature," Miss Marple concluded, "is not often loud or dramatic in its truths. It whispers in hesitations, trembles in avoidance, and speaks in the unconscious movements of the body. By observing patiently, by noting the smallest details, one can discern what words alone may obscure." The villagers listened, quiet and reflective, understanding for the first time that the outward appearances they had relied upon were only part of the story. As the assembly dispersed, life in Nethercombe resumed its ordinary rhythm, but with a subtle shift. The villagers, now more aware of the delicate balance between observation and assumption, carried themselves with gentle caution and deeper understanding. Miss Marple, her eyes scanning the green one last time, allowed herself a soft smile. The case was concluded, not with dramatics, but with insight, patience, and an unwavering attention to the nuances of human behavior. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the rolling hills and shadows stretched across the village, Miss Marple sat by her window with a quiet cup of tea. Nethercombe, outwardly calm and orderly, retained the echoes of subtle truths, hidden motives, and protective instincts. And Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, reflected on the enduring lesson. Human nature, intricate and delicate, reveals itself in the smallest of ways, and in those ways lies the path to understanding, justice, and resolution.